Thank you again for joining us. You probably understood the strategy. We try to fix the technical part of the side of the discussion while we get more participants. So we hope that works. And in case we need more seats, we have a few chairs behind us. So feel free to come and get them if we don't have enough space in the room. Thanks so much. It's so lovely to have so many people in the room. And of course, we expect to have very good discussion among all of us. I will right away get starting, because I think we have to manage that we finish on time. My name is Jean-Paul Brissafana. I work with Germanwatch as a policy advisor for climate finance and development. Today, as you can see on the screen, as you have also heard from the communication we have done, we are going to explore a way that is about engaging more civil society and mobilizing more actors, non-stakeholder actors in the Gcf activities, projects, and processes. And we want to realize multi-stakeholder mobilization and readiness to the Green Climate Fund. We have a very diverse range of contributors to this discussion. This includes you, first of all of you, and then we have those 4 panelists who join us today. We have Mr. Julius Karanjambatia. He's Assistant Program Officer with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. We have Mr. Kimaren Ole Riamit, who is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Livelihood Enhancement Partners. And we have Dr. Curtis Dobler, I hope I pronounced well. He's representing the International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations, but he will also tell us exactly about his title and the organization which he represents here at the COP. And we have Mrs. Julia Grimm, who is Policy Advisor at Germanwatch on climate finance, and she's also the coordinator of the Adaptation Fund NGO Network. So I would like to quickly, before we give them the floor and we give you also the opportunity to interact with this panel, try to recall a little bit the context of our session today. We have seen in the last years the development of the Green Climate Fund. It's a new mechanism that is there to make sure that adaptation, mitigation, and cross-cutting related issues about addressing climate change can have access to available resources from developed countries. And the target of the Green Climate Fund include developing countries, especially those that are the most vulnerable, which are the SIDS, small island developing states, the least developed countries, and of course the African nations. And this helps these different countries to have the facility to develop programs and projects that will help cities, communities, and nations to face climate change, especially in the adaptation, mitigation, and of course, as I said already, the cross-cutting level of the problems. And the Green Climate Fund, of course, aims to be the most ambitious mechanism in that regard, because the fund has this huge capacity to deliver, and it also aims to have a paradigm shift in terms of transformation at the national level, and how the project can really change the life of the people and make sure that this has an impact in a very long term. And of course, when you talk about making an impact at the local level, you also talk about the beneficiaries. And how can the beneficiaries be part of the solution? How can they also be able to speak out about the way they engage or the way they face challenges regarding that engagement? This side event is also related to a project that is currently implemented by Germanwatch with CARE International and the support of many partner organizations across the African continent, including PACJA, which is here with us. And this project is called CSO Readiness to the Green Climate Fund, Focus Africa. For the time being, we focus on the region, but the aim is to extend it to other regions when the resources and the learning allow us to do so. And we have seen different ways to make that engagement work, but at the same time, we have also faced several challenges. And this panel today is there to help us to figure out how can we realize a more effective and meaningful participation of multi-stakeholder in the Green Climate Fund, but also how can readiness help us to make sure that before projects start being implemented at the national level, people, communities, government, local entities have the power, the capacity, and the skills to be part of a process that will make a contribution to this paradigm shift that the GCF aims for. So I would like to start right away with Julius. Julius, as you can see, is a very young, dynamic, passionate young man. I have to say it because I confirm I have participated to several events and project activities with him. And Julius is not only passionate, he's also very interested about the impact on the long-term way. And Julius is going to set the theme for this session, because Julius has been part of a regional workshop that we have organized in Marrakesh in the merging of the last COP. So 1 year later, we are here. And this has demonstrated that we have several challenges that we actually face as civil society to engage with the Green Climate Fund. And I think that we will be able to hear from his perspective about what is the big picture at the moment. Why do we have these challenges, and also what could be the ways to overcome them? Then we will move to other speakers who will give us concrete examples in different specific areas. And we will be happy, of course, after that to have an engaging communication and dialogue with all the people in the room. Thanks so much. Julius, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm introduction and the profound background as well. So the reason why we're here is because the GCF matters to us. As civil society organizations, we have to be part of the GCF processes, either at the international circles or even at the country level where action is actually being undertaken. So the reason why we are here again is because the GCF is very important to us. We interact as civil society organizations with the communities, and the communities actually trust us to the point that they allow us to represent them in some of these spaces. So as we're going to do this simple discussion today, I would want us to look at where exactly do we stand as civil society organizations, informed by some of the perspectives from Africa, and also how do we then use or utilize the space that we have as civil society organizations in the world, informed by insights also from Africa, to make sure that the GCF works for the people that it's supposed to work for. So climate actions need to be financed. We agree to that, but how do we do this? How do we move forward the agenda of making sure that communities are not left behind the whole of this discussion? So I'm looking at the GCF one from the country level, and I know all of us come from countries, those from developing countries and also those from Africa. You will agree with me that not many of us have been able to actually think through and understand or break the GCF down to a point or level which we can actually work with or actually inform at the country level. I'm looking at this level from the point of we have the NDAs, or the national designated authorities. Some of other countries have the focal points, and in the same countries we have other things or entities that we call the accredited entities, which are supposed to actually submit project proposals and actually implement the same project proposals. So where is our space as civil society organization in all this? In Kenya, for example, let me give an example. We had a meeting with the National Designated Authority, and one of the things that came out was we have a kitty already called the Readiness Kitty, and none of the civil society organizations ever come forward to request or make a request on financing of the readiness of civil society organizations. So in this case, then, where do we stand? And then the government goes ahead and gets actually to get projects in place for readiness for the for the government or the government institutions. At the same time, we have a civil society that is, quotes and quotes, weak and cannot monitor, since we have not been part of the readiness at the country level. So we cannot actually get to hold our governments accountable because the process goes so much ahead and we cannot be part of the process. So we are looking at a space that is both policy advocacy and at the same time implementation space. So we sit together, for instance, with the government and decide or discuss on how best to have our country actually get ready for the Green Climate Fund. And getting ready means that every actor, all actors, non-state actors, and even government inclusive, is ready enough to actually design project proposals that actually reflect the position of communities, the needs of communities, and submit these proposals to the GCF. Going now to that other level, that's the international level, we are looking at a place or a space for civil society organizations to engage in reviewing proposals for the GCF or at the GCF level. But at this level also we lack a lot of capacity. What we say is basically we do not have to wait for a project proposal to get to the GCF board for it to actually be considered. In this, I mean that we will not wait as civil society organizations for a project proposal at the board level to review it. We have the ability and capacity to be in the technical teams at the country level to actually design project proposals together with the technical teams of the government, now playing a collaborative role at that point. And then at the same time, we have the capacity to actually move forward with the project proposals, go to the GCF secretariat and the board level and monitor monitor how the progress is, do input. There's always a lot of call of input and also back and forth between the Secretariat, the GCF Secretariat, and country focal points on proposals. So who comes in to bring out the voice of the communities at this level? And this is exactly why we are here to discuss why and what is the space of civil society organizations. I am looking at also the question of monitoring projects at the country level. So, for example, right now in the B18, we had 11 projects approved by the board, the GCF board, this totaling to a tune of $392 million US. So these projects go back to communities. Who goes back with the community projects? If it's not the civil society organization to actually get to communicate the challenges of community organizations, which could be executing entities in most of the instances, civil society organizations partnering with government to implement projects as executing entities. So we have challenges at that level. For instance, late disbursement of funds. So who goes out and communicates on the urgent need to address climate change impacts at the community level, where else there is no money that has been released at that point? So who goes out and communicates this? So this is the unique space of the civil society organizations that I'm actually pointing out at, because we have the role and the sole responsibility to do a lot of policy advocacy at both levels, but at the same time, the role of actually showing or shedding light on how projects should be designed and how the people in the communities want the projects to be implemented. So, the accredited entities, we have seen this a lot of times, and most of the accredited entities are doing concept notes and sending to the GCF Secretariat without even the countries knowing them or being aware of the project proposals, so, or the concept ideas. So who is there to speak about this? Now, the board meeting, the 17th board meeting actually came out to the decision that any concept note submitted to the GCF must have the consent of the focal point of the National Designated Authority. So this, following this up closely, I followed this, and the discussion was that now we do not want to burden the focal points. We don't want to put a lot of measures, a lot of regulations, a lot of paperwork for them, so we cannot really define what consent means for the focal points. It's up to them to see how it works for them. Then who then, as the civil society organizations, comes out and says, for you to talk about a project in a country, for example, Ethiopia, you need to have the consent of the country. And in that country consent, we're talking about a letter of no objection, for example, and we're talking about communities saying that we were consulted and free and prior consent was given for project implementation in this area. So that is also a space that we are seeing as civil society organizations as an opportunity for us to engage in terms of the evolving discussion on consent for projects for the countries. And maybe just to highlight a bit on influencing the GCF process, and this is interesting for me because we are looking at the executing entity as the person who gets to receive the financing from the GCF to implement a project. To what extent then do we get to engage our executing entities in our countries? To what extent do we engage our executing entities at the regional level? Because with the different status of accreditation of the accredited entities, we can engage at any level as civil society organizations. So that when an accredited entity submits a proposal, it's not for the sake of the accredited entity, but it's to the benefit of the communities on the ground, addressing the challenges and the impacts of climate change. So this is also a discussion that we are trying to actually look at deeply in this discussion, because we have seen a lot of projects being presented at the GCF Secretariat, and due to the different geopolitics, as you understand, at that level, proposals are being they're being approved, and then the accredited entity goes out to implement a project and does not inform an executing entity that a project has been approved, this is the amount of money that has been received so far, and this is what we want to do. So there's a lot of gap, there's big time gap, and that needs to be addressed in terms of communication between civil society organizations, between the civil society organizations and the focal points, the accredited entities. And for this then, the only person who can play the logical role is civil society organizations. And I believe in this because communities, as I said, have entrusted us with a big mandate to watch out for their buck, to watch out for their buck in terms of their interests. So that the interests of communities are represented at all levels, both at the international level and also at the national level. As I finished, my contribution is that a lot is happening in Africa again. We are seeing the formation of committees, coordination units for the GCF by governments. And these are spaces as well that we need to engage in. In Rwanda, for instance, the civil society organization and Malawi came out clearly to say that if we are talking about receiving finances for climate action to enhance vulnerability or resilience, to enhance resilience of communities, then we're talking about a process that ensures that we are represented at the decision-making level, but that representation is not enough. We are actually engaged in a continuous and structured manner. And this has been the challenge with most of the engagement processes, because most of the civil society organizations are called to do input and insights at the point when some people feel like having us or our voices at that place, and that is not the way. If we're talking about enhanced action, we are talking about enhanced engagement. We're talking about civil society organizations being present from the conceptualization phase of an idea to address a certain need, and we're talking about civil society organizations being present at the decision making and also being present to follow up decisions and actions and implementation processes. So that means that a different realm or a different approach to civil society engagement is needed. And who gets to do that? It's us, as civil society organizations. I think I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
I'm fully sure that after those few minutes, you agree with me that Julius has the passion we need to get started with the discussion. So it was also a good choice to put you at the beginning of this panel. I have heard a lot of accredited entities, implementing entities, executing entities. This is the language we have to do with. We have to deal with this language because that's the language of the Green Climate Fund. It's the language of the UNFCCC. It's also the language we have to know in order to find the right approaches to get engaged and to have, of course, this impact. We are not going to explain all these different denomination, but we will invite you when you have some time to also go to the GCF pavilion, which is here in the Bond Zone, to get to know more about the work they do so that you also get familiar with this wording, because it will come back again and again during our discussion. I really like the critical and constructive approach you suggest, Julius, regarding how can we really make sure that civil society is not only participating, but actually having a way to make an impact, but also how do we create opportunities for CSOs. But at the same time, CSOs could also be very less represented because it's about bringing the issues and the voice of the communities where the projects are being implemented. And when you go through the GCF portfolio, you see where projects are going to take place. It's a range of locations around the world. The portfolio is over 40 projects at the moment for a large amount of money that has been allocated. But at the same time, how do we make sure that the different categories of stakeholders involved in the GCF activities can actually have a voice, but also a mechanism that is ongoing? And we have also seen recently that the GCF has made some effort in terms of developing frameworks and policies that will actually help engaging more communities, different stakeholders. And this is also one case regarding indigenous people. And we would like to welcome now Kimaren, who is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Livelihoods Enhancement Partners. It's a network bringing the voice of indigenous people in this climate-related discussion. And Kimaren is also representing Tebtebba, which is one of the partner organizations involved in this side event, and we have some representative in the room. Thanks for joining us. And Kimaren is going to explore exactly what is this new policy on indigenous people that the GCF is currently developing that is being updated at the moment, but also what kind of opportunities are available when we want to engage more various groups in this mechanism that can be seen complex. Kimaren, I have your presentation here with me. I will give you the floor to get started. I have to put it on the computer for 1 second, so please.
A very good afternoon to all of us, and it's good to see the room full. Thank you to Tebtebba and to the Germanwatch for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts and experiences. on this very critical question. I think talking about stakeholder engagement, mobilization, and participation, to me, at the risk of simplifying it, oversimplification, I think there are three elements. One of it is really recognizing who these stakeholders are, their interests and rights. The second element has to do with creating spaces for these stakeholders to engage. And the third element has to do with enabling this participation to happen. And so in my presentation, I want to highlight a bit the extent to which these three elements are reflected or not within the Green Climate Fund in the context of indigenous people as stakeholders. We would like to sort of present ourselves as right holders and less stakeholders because we believe we are custodians of nature. And I want to provide a bit of a background. I think first that when we talk about climate change, it's really about people-nature relations. And we are recognizing almost a little late that this relationship has been distorted. That through unsustainable exploitation of nature, the climate is responding negatively, and we are feeling the negative impact of our engagement with nature. And therefore, the goal of the UNFCCC is to try and slow down this process, if not restore the positive people-nature relations. And thinking about these relations, indigenous peoples' research has shown now that indigenous people are harmoniously, relatively to other communities, living positively with nature. In essence, therefore, indigenous people represent the future that we aspire to achieve in the context of climate change. And so, but not only do indigenous people represent the future that we aspire to achieve, but their livelihoods are very dependent on these natural systems. And because of this, climate change, negative impacts of climate change affect them much more strongly or heavily than other sectors of society. But they are not only affected by negative impacts of climate change, they are also affected by intervention measures that are not safeguarded being implemented in the name of climate change. We have seen, for example, in the name of RED evictions in forest sector. We have seen in the name of clean development mechanisms, evictions of pastoral communities in Kenya to access geothermal. And if we go beyond there and look at the circumstances of indigenous people in national spaces, the sorry state is basically because of this historical marginalization and exclusion in the name of development. Climate change has come to us in this situation. Beyond this, indigenous people are not just victims. They are holders of a rich diversity of knowledge that can inform solutions and interventions around climate change. But the Green Climate Fund is coming in as a new pathway to development in the context of climate change. And so the question is, to what extent will the Green Climate Fund worsen the situation of indigenous people, or at least avoid the flaws and the exclusion and exploitation witnessed in previous development pathways that we have witnessed? Very quickly, when you look at the setup of the Green Climate Fund, you realize that in its architecture, it recognizes indigenous people as a stakeholder, but it doesn't recognize indigenous people as an independent constituency with a right to active observer status like, say, civil society. Civil society in the Green Climate Fund have only two positions, one from the north and one from the south. Despite the reality that the UNFCCC recognizes indigenous people as an independent constituency, the Green Climate Fund subsumed them within their larger CSO space. Looking at the fund access modalities for the Green Climate Fund, it's such that the fiduciary standard, the capacities and the competencies required to access the Green Climate Fund is such that it is inaccessible by indigenous people organizations, given the kind of capacities required. But when you also look at the delivery mechanisms of the Green Climate Fund, the so-called country ownership and country drivenness, while it is good that our governments and state parties at the developing countries level now are in the steering seat of climate change development, unfortunately, it's these national circumstances that has produced the unfortunate situation of indigenous people. So this unique status of indigenous people, the country ownership arrangement may not respond to the unique situation of indigenous peoples. And therefore, the other challenge we are seeing within the Green Climate Fund for engagement for indigenous people is that while global practice with respect to indigenous people's rights and perspective is really increasing positively, the UNFCCC is what gave birth to the Green Climate Fund. And now indigenous knowledge is recognized, indigenous people's rights are recognized. Even the indigenous people platform is created within the UNFCCC framework. But the Green Climate Fund has been a little slow to recognize this. When you look at the Cancun decision on RED safeguards, the Warsaw decision on community-based monitoring information systems, the Green Climate Fund has been a little slow in picking up these gains within the mother institution that gave birth to it. And so, as indigenous people engaging within the Green Climate Fund, we have had 3 questions to ask within this framework. One of them is really establishing a facility through which indigenous people can access the funding of the Green Climate Fund in order to demonstrate through their indigenous knowledge how they can contribute to mitigation and adaptation, in order to demonstrate the value of non-carbon benefits which are recognized within the UNFCCC, in order to demonstrate how communities can contribute to monitoring RED and other interventions at the ground level. The second key ask we are asking as indigenous people within the Green Climate Fund is really a robust consultative arrangement that enables indigenous people to engage in the Green Climate framework. This will constitute, for example, an advisory body to the Green Climate Fund for indigenous people. We already have a private sector advisory group, and we thought it would be useful to bring this unique perspective of indigenous people through an advisory group arrangement. We also thought that we need to infuse the Secretariat with this perspective by having a focal point on indigenous issues within the Green Climate Fund Secretariat. We're also hoping that this active observer status will also be accorded to indigenous peoples. And third, that this would be enabled through an indigenous people policy within the Green Climate Fund to guide all the activities and interventions supported by the Green Climate Fund through the accredited entities, through the national designated authorities and other implementing entities. And moving forward to what we have gained so far as indigenous peoples, one of the things we have learned is partnership and collaboration as actors, as stakeholders, is critical to influence the Green Climate Fund. Through the creative engagement with civil society active observers, we've managed to create an active alternate observer position for indigenous people within the Green Climate Fund. While the governing instrument does not provide this, but through creative engagement as CSOs and indigenous people, I was graciously nominated as one of the active observers, alternate active observers, bringing the indigenous people's perspective to the Green Climate Fund. We have also seen a number of accredited entities that have policies on indigenous people, that have dedicated financing arrangement with indigenous people, getting accredited as potential implementing actors under the Green Climate Fund. Recently, the Green Climate Fund adopted a decision on results-based payment for RED, which has a number of interesting elements. It recognizes a Cancun decision on safeguards, the Warsaw decisions, and actually speaks about an IP policy coming to being in the future, which it will aspire to respect in the context of results-based payment for RED. And we think, again, this is another space where there are placeholders to provide for active engagement of indigenous people, if not safeguarding their interests. When you look at the country readiness arrangement and the multi-stakeholder engagement arrangement associated with the GCF readiness, there is specific mention of indigenous peoples as a key stakeholder, indigenous people in the local communities as a key stakeholders to be engaged in the readiness. And it's important because if your agenda misses in the readiness arrangement of the state or national government, then certainly in the funding setup that will follow and the project proposals that follow, the likelihood of your interest and perspective missing will be real. And they are also, we have witnessed in the projects that come to the Green Climate Fund, as active observers, we have managed to attach a number of conditions, including free, prior, and informed consent requirements to projects that will be implemented in indigenous people territories. And so we have seen, for example, a project in Tanzania and a few others where the board had to attach a condition to protect the indigenous people's rights in the context of implementation of that project. Now the GCF has a draft policy document on environmental and social management framework, which has a very encouraging, I think, elements on the need to integrate indigenous people's rights in the environmental and social safeguards of the Green Climate Fund. Finally, what we have seen also is that we now have a second iteration of a draft fund-wide indigenous people policy under the Green Climate Fund. Has very, very interesting, I think, elements. The deadline for submission is December 8th. And in terms of lessons, we have learned, again, collaboration is key. If we don't collaborate as stakeholders, our voices will be diluted and will have little impact in engaging with the Green Climate Fund. Engagement with readiness is critical because this is where the roadmap for national arrangement for engaging with the Green Climate Fund established. And we are also, as indigenous people now, drafting a global framework through which we hope we can access funds by indigenous people to fund pilot activities within indigenous people territories by indigenous people supported by the Green Climate Fund. And I want to thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kimaren, also. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate you, all your colleagues, and all the different colleagues and stakeholders that have been involved in making sure that the GCF actually include the idea of having an indigenous people policy being developed and implemented as part of the fund framework and policies, because it's always an advocacy work and we always have to find ways to use the opportunities that exist. And this has been one of the very concrete examples so far in terms of stakeholders making an impact while engaging in this process. At the same time, I fully agree with you that collaboration is key. And then if we want to explore a way to recognize this position that indigenous people have as a key stakeholder, we have to create more in terms of not only at the policy level, but also making sure that when projects are being implemented, especially those focusing on recognizing the role of indigenous people to find local solutions, valuing traditional knowledges, we have a way forward that is actually concrete and make an impact that also includes the voice of those that benefit from the project. It's always a difficult way to engage all the voices because we have so much diversity in the way we engage with people around the world. But at the same time, it's difficult also to identify all the valuable input. But nothing is impossible. And when we take time to learn from what others have done, when we take time to explore, to also understand that we have some weaknesses that we could improve, and that is always a space to improve the work we do, we also have the possibility to improve and enhance the way we want to engage and also make an impact. I would like to now take a bit of experience sharing approach, because in the side event description we also say we want to bring experience for other financial institutions that are involved with the UNFCCC. And we have Julia Grimm. She expected to be the last speaker of our panel, but I know that if I would have done that, everyone would have been very angry with us, because we have to balance not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of input to the contribution we make today. Julia is coordinator of the Adaptation Fund NGO Network. As you heard it, it's about the Adaptation Fund, which is another financial institution involved in adaptation projects, especially, not like the GCF, which also does mitigation and cross-cutting issues. And the Adaptation Fund NGO Network, Julia will tell us more about, has been very active since a few years already, much more than with the GCF, because the GCF is kind of recent. And this fund has contributed a lot to give the voice we need to civil society. And at the same time, Germanwatch and all the partners involved in this network have been able to share lessons and also learn from this process. And I would like to invite Julia now to present us what is this network about, what can the GCF learn from the Adaptation Fund, but also what can civil society interested to engage with the Green Climate Fund can learn from the engagement of civil society in the Adaptation Fund. We have other financial institutions, we have the Gcf, we have the Special Climate Change Fund, but we just want to take this example for now before going to the next speaker, who will also give us concrete example about how can we enhance civil society participation in the Green Climate Fund. Julia, please.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Paul. I'm glad to be here and to share the experiences of civil society engagement with the Adaptation Fund, which, as most of you might know, is a fund which has been existing and working for quite a long time. It's celebrating its 10th anniversary at this COP, so there is a lot of experience and best practices that we can learn from civil society's engagement with the Adaptation Fund, which can be taken to the Green Climate Fund, which is still a quite new organization and still has or might learn something of the best practices that I want to share with you right now. But first I would like to quickly present a little bit what the network is all about. The Adaptation Fund NGO Network was founded about 7 years ago. It's coordinated by Germanwatch, and it was founded at the time when the Adaptation Fund actually adopted its first project, so it has been actively engaged from the beginning on. It's a coalition of NGOs, mostly from the Global South, which are following the development and processes of the Adaptation Fund, including its funded projects in the countries. Its focus is on the most vulnerable people and how to enhance their interests. And we have collaboration with active NGOs in the Global South who are independently accompanying Adaptation Fund projects, which is quite important task, as we think. And the Adaptation Fund NGO Network is basically engaging in Adaptation Fund processes and doing advocacy work, also at Adaptation Fund board level. And what it tries is to feed in local experiences from the ground into international processes like the UNFCCC process or the Adaptation Fund board meetings. Quickly, what is the civil society engagement and the activities that the network is doing on the national level? Our active network partners do bottom-up consultations with Adaptation Fund project beneficiaries on the ground, but they also consult with implementing entities, government agencies, and the decision makers involved in such projects. And so it tries to participate in steering committees of Adaptation Fund projects in the countries to make sure that civil society representing the voice of the most vulnerables has a voice in designing such projects and when it comes to implementation of such projects. They try also to raise awareness and build capacities among other civil society organizations in the countries, so they know more about all the opportunities for engagement with the fund and the projects and can take advantage of those opportunities. They try to do advocacy for more participation and transparency and try to make sure that the projects have a greater focus on the most vulnerable ones. And additionally, they implement multi-stakeholder workshops where they bring together different stakeholders from academia, CSOs, governments, implementing agencies to exchange. Next slide, please. So then, as most of you also might know, recently the Adaptation Fund started its regional pilot, and the first regional projects were approved. So that's why we also think that civil society also has to engage more on the regional level, accompany those regional projects, and build stronger regional networks with other CSOs in order to be able to adequately accompany those projects. And yeah, here you can see a picture of a regional workshop that recently took place in Benin, where different stakeholders were informed about the Adaptation Fund's processes and how to engage. Next slide, please. Then the last level on which we are active is the international level. The network tries to feed in the local experiences made, the local best practices gained into international processes like the Adaptation Fund board meeting. Yeah, at the Adaptation Fund board meeting, usually our active NGO partners share recent stories about the projects implemented, share best practices, but also share when, from the perspective of civil society, something is going wrong in the project, to raise awareness among board members. And then we annually meet for a strategic workshop to also look at how can we still improve the CSO engagement and contribution at the Adaptation Fund, and also how can we take the experiences that we made to the level of the GCF, how can we share these experiences with other stakeholders. And we also often see that the stakeholders involved in the Adaptation Fund are also the stakeholders involved at the GCF. So yeah, there are a lot of synergies and lessons that can be learned. So I would quickly like to, next slide please, yeah, mention a few best practices that we as a network identified at the Adaptation Fund, which allow for really active and constructive CSO engagement. This is on the one hand the civil society dialogue at Adaptation Fund board meetings. This is something quite unique, which doesn't exist so far at other climate funds, and could maybe also be inspiring for GCF CSO participation. This is actually a time slot that civil society gets during Adaptation Fund board meetings, where they have about an hour or an hour and a half to talk to board members at the board meetings and present recent developments. And yeah, so we are very grateful for this space as civil society, and we see also that it's very much appreciated by Adaptation Fund board members to listen to those local stories and yeah, get into exchange with us as civil society. So there is another very good best practice which we consider, which is that there is the opportunity to comment on project proposals. This is an opportunity which is also quite unique at the GCF, for example. There's no opportunity to comment on project proposals before the board meeting. Only during the board meeting they have the room to comment on it. But at the Adaptation Fund, proposals are uploaded, and every organization or individual is able to submit comments on the proposals, which then could be considered before approving those projects and can make them even better. yeah, then another great achievement is also that at the Adaptation Fund, civil society is also recognized as a group which receives readiness support. The Adaptation Fund NGO Network was invited also to a meeting of readiness providers where experiences of readiness support were shared, and yeah, the Adaptation Fund recognizes that we as civil society also need to make CSOs in the countries ready to actively participate in the processes of the funds. Yeah, then there was the opportunity, back please. Yeah, there was the opportunity, for example, or to comment on the medium-term strategy of the fund. There was a public call for comments on the website, which is great. A lot of comments from civil society were actually also considered in the document, which was recently approved. And yeah, also at the 10th anniversary event, which will take place on the 16th of November during the COP now, stories of stakeholders are shared. The stories of stakeholders and their engagement in the Adaptation Fund are shared. This also shows how the Adaptation Fund appreciates the contribution of civil society, and yeah, we think as a network during the last years we could really increase the attention towards civil society contributions, and yeah, had great opportunities to collaborate with the board and the secretariat of the fund. And yes, next slide please. We think there's still some room for improvement. Although it has several best practices which doesn't exist at the GCF level. Of course, we think that there's still room to improve processes so civil society can engage more actively and constructively. So yeah, although we have the room to talk during the CSO dialogue to board members, there is no opportunity to comment under each agenda item during the board meeting, which actually the active CSO representatives at the GCF can do. So there might also be things where the Adaptation Fund can learn from the GCF regarding CSO engagement. And of course, I think that's a problem that's true for both funds, that documents regarding the board meetings are published very late, only a few days or hours before board meetings sometimes, which doesn't allow for active CSO engagement, because also CSOs need time to prepare to read those documents to actually, or to have meaningful engagement. So yeah, that's one thing that should be improved at both funds. And then also that sometimes sessions are closed, not at all sessions during board meetings. Civil society can actively engage because they are not allowed in the room. At the Adaptation Fund, especially the committees, the project and program committee and the ethics and finance committee, they meet in closed session where observers are not allowed. And yeah, and regarding transparency, also the project performance reports, which are often for CSOs in the countries the only opportunity to actually get information about the projects, and which should be uploaded annually on the Adaptation Fund's homepage, are not always online, which also is a lack of transparency which restricts CSO engagement in the countries. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you too, Julia. And we see that there are some lessons that we can learn at the GCF level regarding the Adaptation Fund and civil society involvement. And at the same time, you also took time to reflect and then raise the fact that we also have to still improve some areas of engagement. And I think that's a good way to present the advantages and also the need for improvement. And that could help us, of course, to reflect a bit more further. We could say that today the GCF, the fact that the GCF is at the beginning, not early beginning, but at the beginning of developing all the policies, the processes, and the frameworks, is also a window of opportunity for civil society. Because when everything is already settled, built, it's difficult to reform and change. But when we are part of the beginning of a new process, it's always a good opportunity also to also help design it. But at the same time, learning from other funds and other processes engaged in the mechanism and the financial mobilization of the resources is also a way for us to think further. I know you have prepared some concrete example related to the countries involved in the Adaptation Fund NGO network that you would have loved to share with the audience, because I can see it on my screen, but you cannot see it on yours. So we just want to apologize that we didn't provide you with this facility. But the way you have highlighted all the few examples is actually very good. Sorry if it sounds confusing. I would like us to do something that is, we heard that word since yesterday or the days before, since this conference started, this famous Talanoa. I hope I pronounce it well. It's Talanoa, right? Who knows what does that mean? No one knows what it means. Somebody would like to try? What means Talanoa? Any volunteer? Talanoa? No? Yes, sir, please. Okay, perfect. That's a very good definition. Any other definition? I heard a very short one also recently. Sitting together, discussing together, listening to each other, active listening. I think that's the way he also described. So Talanoa is this Fijian word that means active listening. And when we listen to each other in a very active way, it also means we can have a dialogue together. And the facilitative dialogue, new proposed name is actually the Talanoa dialogue, as far as we are going in that direction. We would like to give the floor to our last contributor in this panel, but before that, we want to listen a little bit from you about the views and also maybe some experiences you have, because some of you in the room are very active in the GCF processes, and we are sure you have something to share with this panel. At the same time, it will be a way for us to make sure that we have this active listening and dialogue all together, so that we don't miss half of our participants in the room who are now going to the GCF pavilion to get more information. But let's just finish the discussion here first. And we have a microphone or two in the room, which will be able to circulate. And I would like to open the floor for a 15 minutes exchange and interaction with our panelists, and you are also welcome to engage in that discussion. And after that, we will come back to the last contributor in the panel, and then we will open another round for interaction. Please raise your hand, get the microphone, introduce yourself, and go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like only to say that I come from Peru. My name is Alberto Paniagua, and I come from the first CSO in Latin America accredited by the Green Climate Fund. So I guess it's something that you needed to know. And secondly, I'm not going to discuss all the different proposals here, but I would also like to say that the very first project ever approved by the GCF is a project with indigenous peoples in my country, in the Amazon region, in the wetlands of the Amazon region. 7 different indigenous people, 7 different languages, 7 different cultures are today together in that project to develop a new approach of taking care of the natural capital they have in the Amazon region. So that's only to give you an information that anyway, the very first project approved by the GCF is an indigenous peoples project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the information. Any other reaction in the room? I have seen a, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Hasbi from Indonesia. My organization already accredited for the Adaptation Fund, and then now we are still developing some project concept note with the GSOs. I would like to ask Julia, as you already presented many good practices, but it is more on the practices in the board meeting and in the headquarters of the process of the adaptation fund. I would like to ask you: are there any good practices on the project preparations and implementations in the country? Thank you.
Thank you. One more intervention from the floor, the audience. We got one there, one here. I think we have a hand there, which is about to be raised. Yes, in the back, behind you. Thank you.
Thank you very I'm Pasang Durma Sherpa from Nepal. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentations and the GCF and as well as an adaptation fund. GCF definitely a long struggle for indigenous peoples to recognize our rights to be addressed by all this GCF fund. We are really hopeful that the indigenous policy will really address the challenges indigenous peoples have been facing at the ground level. And saying that, I would like to listen the experiences of this adaptation NGO fund that you have shared. Like, have you also worked with indigenous peoples? Because indigenous peoples are the ones who are really affected by the climate change impacts. And then the indigenous peoples with their traditional knowledge and customary practices, they have been innovative for adapting to this climate circumstances, climate impacts, and then vulnerable to the climate change, especially for surviving of their continuation of their sustainable livelihoods. So have you also worked with indigenous people organizations, and how have you been contributing for strengthening their traditional knowledge, their the continuation of their customary institution, so that they continue struggling for adapting to the impacts of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I registered 2 questions that are directed to Julia, and also one comment that I'm sure Kimaren would like to react to. Julia, what is the previous experience of the AFN working with indigenous people? That will be the first point. And also, do you have any best practice in terms of project development, design, where you have managed to successfully engage civil society as part of the AFN activities?
Yes, thank you for your questions. So I will first try to quickly answer your question regarding the indigenous peoples. The Adaptation Fund NGO Network has more than 200 member organizations, of whom several are also indigenous people organizations, so they are represented quite well within the network. And of course, when our partner organizations look at proposals in the countries and do their advocacy work, it's mainly to, or in the interest of the most vulnerable ones, which are also mainly indigenous peoples in the countries, and to assure their rights are respected, and we consider that a core part of our work. And regarding the question how NGOs or CSOs are also involved in the project implementation process, also coming back to the comment the Mr. from Peru made, we see that a lot of implementing entities also open up calls for project proposals to civil society organizations in the countries where they actively participate and can contribute with project proposals. And also at the Adaptation Fund project in South Africa, it's a small grant facility where also several community-based organizations and CSOs can make proposals which then are considered by the implementing entity. So yeah, of course, that's another important part of CSOs, besides the independent watchdog role they have, to also actively engage in the implementation process of projects and also contribute to the development of project proposals.
Thank you, Julia. Kimaren, The first ever project approved by the GCF board was a project focusing on indigenous people rights.
Yes, indeed, I want to agree with my brother from Peru. And some of us were privileged to be in Zambia when this project came up for consideration by the board. And it was a useful trigger within the GCF to consider the indigenous people question and to consider instruments of engagement like the free, prior, and informed consent. And this project really generated a lot of very, very useful discussion. And this is where the genesis of the indigenous people policy within the GCF commenced. How does the GCF deal with indigenous, with project to be implemented in indigenous people territory? So I just want to agree with you to say, yes, indeed, this was a project, and the project proposal are increasingly becoming the space to strengthen engagement by questioning and enhancing the modalities of engagement at a country level and project level by the various stakeholders. So project proposal really is another critical control point for stakeholders to engage within the GCF and shape the kind of proposals that will be supported by the fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimaren. I'm sure we will take another round after introducing the presentation from our last contributor, Dr. Curtis Dobler. You will be able to bring us back again to how does it look like, in general, the CSO participation in the Green Climate Fund processes and proceeding and activities and projects, but also what is the governing instrument of the fund saying regarding civil society and multi-stakeholder participation, and what can we learn from the different challenges that CSOs and other parties involved are facing, and what could be a way to overcome those challenges, some ways forward.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Germanwatch for inviting actually my colleague, Matika from PACIA, who I'm replacing here because unfortunately, my colleague Oshota from ISMUN, who is not able to make this today. I'm a research professor at the University of Makeni in Sierra Leone, and I also represent an NGO here called internationallawyers.org, which is not accredited to the UNFCCC, but to the African Union and to the UN, and we operate under ISMUN's umbrella as a accredited entity or observer before the UNFCCC procedures. I'm going to look, as a lawyer, I'm going to take us back perhaps maybe from the nitty-gritty of the policy and the political discussion, which we've heard and which I've heard very interesting suggestions from, because that's really how it works in practice. But I think it's also important to remember a little bit where we started on this and what is the basis of participation in civil society. I should say I've attended since 2007 the COPs, which means that I was there during most of the time and followed the creation of the Green Climate Fund and know a little bit about the ups and downs, the limitations of it, and where civil society particularly hoped that there would be an expanded right or avenue for participation. And I'll come back to that very briefly then. I'll try to keep my presentation fairly short because I want to hear more from all of you and we have limited time here. But you can see there on the screen the basic principles regarding participation. The first three are not really participation, but they give you the context in which NGO or civil society participation or observer participation, as we call it in the UNFCCC or climate forums, can be exercised. I think the first is important to remember that the Green Climate Fund was set up to help achieve the objective of the UNFCCC. That's the reason for the fund. Everything it does should be able to be traced back to that. And secondly, and I'll come back to this again, is the issue of accountability. It says accountability to the COP, but as you know, the COP and all the institutions of the UNFCCC also have accountability to we the people because they function under the larger umbrella of the United Nations. And I'll come back to that aspect of accountability because perhaps accountability is the single most important reason for participation of civil society in institutions like the Green Climate Fund. And the third there you see that the Green Climate Fund board And that's important because it is the board which is guided and accountable to the co-op, but has a separate legal entity, or is a separate legal entity, the GCF, and its board is fully responsible for the funding decisions. That board does not include any non-state actors. It doesn't include private actors from corporations or civil society actors. It only includes 24 representatives nominated by states. But there are avenues in the guiding instrument. That's what GI stands for there, and the paragraphs are to that instrument, which was adopted by the COP to create the GCF. There are avenues for participation by civil society or non-state actors. Now, it should be clear, we heard that there, as you see there in the fourth little paragraph there, that the GCF is mandated. It says not may, but will make arrangements for effective participation of accredited observers, including civil society observers there, and one each from developing countries and from developed countries. But you should also read further that it also provides that equal representation for corporate entities. And I draw attention to that because of something that's been said here, which I'll come back to, and that's the matter of resources. Because essentially, when there's a board meeting of the GCF, it is civil society that is, if you will, the poor, or the poorest of the participants in the room, which means it has less resources to attend the meeting, to participate in the meeting, to prepare for the meeting, and to follow up its participation there. In fact, one might say that till now, the effectiveness of civil society in the Green Climate Fund has been very much left up not to institutional or structural or constitutional arrangements, but it has been left up to the ingenuity of the particular civil society representatives who are attending the board meetings. And lastly, you'll see that the GFC is also supposed to more generally to develop mechanisms to promote the input and participation of stakeholders, which again includes civil society. And as you see there, indigenous peoples, that's what our colleague talked about. Indigenous peoples are mentioned there, but not in the arrangements for observers. So there are two ways, essentially, that the guiding instrument of the Green Climate Fund foresees participation by non-state actors. One is through observing, and I emphasize observing with the caveat to what my colleague said here, that they are able to speak on agenda items, but whether or not that's listened to is always a very questionable item. And secondly, that the board is supposed to make provisions for their input and participation, which would assume to go beyond just observer participation, participation in the actual decisions that the Green Climate Fund makes. And we've heard some, rather, I noted them very well because we are in contact with some of our representatives on the Green Climate Fund board. I've heard some quite interesting suggestions here today as to how civil society might participate even outside the board, and I think perhaps those are maybe going to be more effective in the way that civil society should look to. Let me just look very quickly at some bottlenecks for civil society participation that I think I've indicated by looking at this, if you will, the statutory provisions for that participation. First, the COP, when we negotiated, or when the states negotiated the Green Climate Fund, was not very comfortable with civil society participation. So it was a struggle to get that in. They were mainly trying to focus on how they could create what at that time I think was thought, and I think by many still is, as the main climate finance entity. So they were worried about ensuring contributions to it and ensuring disbursements in an effective and efficient way. And I think there was a great difference there because most of the discussions concerned developed countries, or might say Annex I countries, not so sure how much they wanted to contribute or even whether they wanted to contribute, and that's why contributions are not assessed. There's no obligation to contribute to the Green Climate Fund. They are voluntary. And on the other side, There were developing countries that already contribute the most in terms of adaptation action because they don't have a choice. They can't wait for outside funding. If their people are subject to flooding or desertification, for example, in Sierra Leone, or destruction of forests, they can't wait for the Green Climate Fund or RED or even the Adaptation Fund to make a decision. They either save their people or their people die or suffer greatly because of the effects of climate change. So on one side, you had this issue of finance. And on the other side, you had this issue of developing countries saying that this should be a mechanism to share the burden between us and developing countries to a greater extent than has happened to date. That played itself out in a huge series of compromises that created the Green Climate Fund. Again, I think it's important to remember, without providing it any financing or any mechanism to ensure financing. You might have heard talk here about replenishment conferences and all for it. That is UN jargon for conferences to essentially ask for money when there is no obligation to provide money. And that is how the Green Climate Fund has been and will be financed. And although we heard there maybe 300, I thought it was closer to 100 and something million available. I'm sure you're all aware of the moral obligation that states undertook at COP15, mainly Annex 1 states again, to provide 100 billion in climate financing. And that's quite a large shortfall between those two figures. And there's also, as we've heard, a problem of information sharing. Often civil society gets information documents too late. Sometimes they do not even get them at all. They're often given more early, I should say, or even though earlier, to the representatives of civil society, the two representatives on the GFC board as observers, but not more widely to civil society. And I can tell you, those observers, in part because of the resource issue I mentioned already, and we'll mention again shortly, they need the assistance of a wider group of civil society with wider expertise to be able to respond to those documents. Even if they have them, that's not very useful, particularly if they relate to a specific area of finance that they're not familiar with. So there is a big dearth right now in information sharing. That means very often civil society goes as an observer to a board meeting with only limited information about what will be considered at that meeting, and particularly limited information of any discussions that took place between states, which are also often very important for understanding what will be considered at that meeting and how the consideration will really take place, what will be the crucial issues. There is also, obviously, an issue of participation, and lastly, an issue of inexperience in using participation rights, which I'll mention very briefly then in the last slide there. And the last slide is just suggestions for moving forward. First, I think there needs to be a greater understanding or recognition by the COP that civil society participation is not only good, not only nice if we can get it, but that it's absolutely necessary today. You cannot respond to problems on the ground. You cannot even know what those problems are unless civil society is involved. And one of the reasons for that, which is not on this slide, but which is very important if you look more, or it is there, sorry, in accountability, is that phrase accountability. I think, and this has not yet been shown through practice because of the small practice to date, but civil society actors will probably be the greatest, have the greatest ability and be the most important actors in ensuring the accountability of the Green Climate Fund and the projects it finances. We've seen that already in other funds. I'm not so sure about the Adaptation Fund. I'd be interested to know if that has been the case, but I am familiar with the World Bank and some of its funding. I was there when we set up a World Bank panel to try to control it and got a very weak panel for that. But for more than 40 years, it has been civil society, although they have very little information, that has pointed out to the bank when a project is actually hurting the local population more than it's helping it. So our experience there has shown that the largest number of problems in World Bank projects, more than the bank itself has recognized through its evaluations, have been pointed out by civil society organizations that watch very carefully. There is also a need to cooperate, for reasons I mentioned before, of civil society to pool their resources. I won't rehash that. There's also a need to use regional forums. How many of you in this room know, for example, that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is at this very moment meeting, and one of the things on their agenda is a study on the adverse effects of human and people's rights on the adverse effects of climate change on human and people's rights in Africa. I think, and that takes me to what I'll make my last point there, that is the need to go beyond just the governing instrument or the guiding instrument of the Green Climate Fund, and to look at legal obligations that states have undertaken that limit the discretion of the fund and require it to act in certain ways in relation to projects it funds, in relation to decisions on projects, and in relation to participants of NGOs. You're probably all aware that both in the COP and in the Green Climate Fund, our participation rights as civil society, or observers as they call us, have been more and more limited. That is contrary to legal obligations that the states that are in these bodies have undertaken. For this COP, for example, the Aarhus Convention applies. Even though it is under Fiji's presidency, it is in Europe, in Germany, a country that has ratified the Aarhus Convention on participation that requires that civil society be allowed to participate in environmental decision-making that affects them. That is also generally the case under human rights instruments for any type of activities that affect the human rights of individuals, and the Green Climate Fund is a body whose activities have significant impacts on individuals' rights. So I hope, and last thing I'll say is I hope civil society will look towards human rights instruments as well as towards the constitutive instruments of the fund to be able to enhance its participation, because that participation needs to be enhanced for the success of that fund, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kobler. And I actually appreciate a lot that you brought also the fact that when we think about the long-term finance and the roadmap to the 100 billion starting in 2020, we have to think about enhancing participation, because this will also help us to ensure accountability, but at the same time address the issue of transparency, which is also being discussed intensively during the negotiation at the moment, and also since the last SB in May. But it's also very important to go back to the guiding instrument of the Green Climate Fund. What does it say? Do we miss some specific guidance about, do we only need to have 2 active observers sitting at board meeting to be engaged in a way that will make it meaningful? But at the same time, what could we learn also? Because that's something maybe Julia could have raised. The Adaptation Fund gives voice to the civil society, make sure that they are involved, they participate, but at the same time, there's not a description or a defined guideline about that. So we have to define the way we want participation to be meaningful, but at the same time, we have to go back to the basic or the instrument that we create so that we align actually the objective with the basic at the early beginning. And sometimes this disconnection could lead to the situation we have now. We want to give space, but we don't know how to make it actually being meaningful. And I really like the fact that you also brought this suggestion for moving forward. This could also help us to have an engaging discussion with the audience now, but at the same time, please make it short, and if possible, direct your point to one of the contributors in our panel so that we can use the time in a very wise way. Thank you so much. So this side would like to start.
Good afternoon. I'm Rima Al-Azhar. I'm with FAO. I am all for civil society engagement. Actually, I worked on this topic myself. However, I have a question. is it the best way for civil society to be engaged is to be present at the board meetings of the GCF? And who would determine that the NGO that's present is actually representative? You talked about the World Bank. The World Bank actually shares its documents on the internet, but the NGOs don't participate in the decision making of the board of the World Bank. So maybe what the Adaptation Fund has shared, as an example, that they share their documents online and then the NGOs can comment on them. I think the participation of NGOs should be at the country level, where the design is being made, where the implementation is being made, and where the monitoring is necessary also to be made, and they have the knowledge. Whereas if you want to bring them to the board meetings, it's a question of capacity, of who's going to fund them, how are they going to be prepared to participate in the board. So I'm not sure this is the best way to have civil society participate, especially since you might actually be giving the fund a cover that we have a civil society organization on the board, but that civil society is not representative actually of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more point in the middle, and then we go to the other side. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Listening to the professor's presentation, which was very interesting, it appears to me that the role of the civil society in the GCF is actually the opposite of what Julius was telling us, because Julius was talking about the possibility of setting an agenda for the meeting, but it comes out very clearly that even when the decisions are being made, the civil society can only be listened to, and their influence cannot, or their views cannot be taken very seriously. That's how I understood it. And in today's, one of the meetings I was attending this morning, the open dialogue to the I think the presidents, there was a clear indication that the civil society will be more engaged now and in the future than it has been in the past. So what is your view then on this? If you are saying that the civil society in the GCF, and we know that the GCF is part of the UNFCCC, will not be given that kind of prominence that we were being told about in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, my name is John Bideri. I'm the co-chair of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance.
Thank you very much. Those are very key points, and I'm sure our panelists would like to address them. Should we get one more there, or should we take one more in the middle? Do you agree? Okay, we go to the gentleman there, please.
Hello, I'm Adnan from the Save the Tigris campaign that is conducted in the Mesopotamia region. My question is actually about how we make the civil society independent of external funds. Because when the just funds is cut down, or when the project has finished, they are by themselves and they may not continue. So maybe specifically to Julia or for anyone to answer it. I think this is the most difficult part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also. I think we will stop there for now. Then we will give the floor to the panel. Julius, I would like to direct this question to you. Engaging in board meetings, is it enough? I know you have been part of GCF board meetings a few times already, and we like to say in the GCF CSO environment that after 4 board meetings, you can already consider yourself as an expert of the GCF. I'm sure you get there soon. But do you think that engaging at the international level is enough, or do we need also to enhance some engagement at the national level, and including how to make it more efficient? What could that look like?
Thank you very much. It's important. We cannot rule it down, because that's where the decisions are being made. But at the same time, it's not enough. As it's been shared, we have our own struggles, and there's a lot of struggles. I remember B17 civil society organizations being controlled on what actually they should say about some accredited entities that had asked for accreditation, and what not to say in terms of by the co-chairs. So it's not enough in terms of representation. These are civil society organizations which actually volunteer to follow the GCF. So they come together and put their resources on the table. They go to the GCF board meetings and come and work as a unit or as a team in terms of following up on different agenda items. So in terms of who represents then comes out from the entire team. So we get to make a decision on who represents us in terms of the active observer, and then the name is forwarded to the Secretariat for actually the authorization. Moving forward, there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done. One, I think we need a GCF CSO network, one that actually has some guidelines on how we will engage with the GCF moving forward, and that will be maybe the first point of engagement. I think a lot has to be done yet.
Thank you, Julius. And we have the case of the World Bank, which has closed decision-making processes not open to civil society. Is there any way to break this wall and make sure that civil society can be part of this complex decision-making process that is not open at the moment? Also based on what the Aarhus Convention says, if I could direct the question to you. Okay.
Let me also just add to what Julius just said, that there is a right for civil society to participate in the governing bodies. So whether they exercise that right, whether it's wise to exercise that right, I think that could be discussed. But I think we should be clear that they have a right to participate in the governing bodies according to the constitutive instrument. And you should note there are, I think, 250 NGOs that come together to decide on who will be the representatives or observers there. So there is quite an effective way of bringing them together. The World Bank, I don't want to go too much on a tangent about the World Bank there. There are certainly, we are quite frustrated, I could say, having been in the meeting that created the World Bank panel, which we thought would be an instrument to be able to affect the decisions, even in aftermath. We don't participate. We can observe from outside, but we don't participate in the board of the World Bank, of course. But we do have other means of being able to review projects in the World Bank. And one of the biggest means is to bring things before the panel there, or to encourage, I should say, affected people to bring things before the panel. Unfortunately, I must say, the World Bank panel only looks at its own internal directives in determining whether or not a project is sufficient. We asked it to look at a broader range of criteria, including human rights. But we have not been able to encourage them to do that, although they are rethinking those right now. And lastly, I just wanted to go off to a tangent of what my colleague here in Pakya said. We've had a lot of discussions with Ambassador Khan about how you can increase participation in the co-op, not so much in the Green Climate Fund, because she's the chief negotiator of Fiji here, who's the presidency of the co-op. They were unwilling to use the Aarhus Convention. They thought, and the reason they were unwilling, I won't go into too much detail because it might be a little bit embarrassing to some, although it's not confidential, but the reason they were unwilling was because of pressure put on them, and including by the host government and some of the others who had been provided to Fiji to be able to facilitate this call. So I think that there needs to be a degree of what we call, or what the Fijians call, not only bula, but also valalaki, which is independence, and the ability to have that independence, and that is often an issue of resources. Fiji could not have taken the presidency of this COPE based on their own resources. And by providing them resources, so almost turning around the question somebody asked about CSOs being involved in resource issues, but even countries, and particularly developing countries, have great restraints, policy restraints, not merely superficial resource restraints on participation, but restraints on how independent their policy can be. And I think unless we address these things, in part through bodies like the GFC, we will not, GCF, we will not be able to have adequate participation until countries are brought up to levels of development that they cannot be coerced by countries of a greater level of development.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kimaren. Julia, I know you would like to add, if you can just do so in 1 minute. I already got a sign that we are over time. And after your point, Kimaren will conclude, and we will have to thank the audience and encourage you to engage further with our panel after the formal timing. Please, Julia, 1 minute, please.
Yes, I will do it brief. I know we are over time already. Just a quick comment on what the lady in the front here from Faro said. That's actually also a problem, that there is the opportunity to contribute, and then, or for example, the project proposals at the Adaptation Fund, then CSOs in the countries open that proposals, then it's a 150 pages document, and a lot of them don't really know how to approach such a document, and that's exactly why we as a network say it's also important to provide readiness support to civil societies so they can meaningfully and actively engage. And that's also what we are working on. But I think the representation at board level is as important as the CSO engagement at the national level, because only when at the board level we push for more transparency, participation, we can ensure such participation at the national level and also feed in the experiences we make as CSOs related to such processes on the national level into those international processes and board meetings. That's why we think both levels are important for civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Kimaren, in 1 minute.
Yes, beginning from where Julia left, I think cross-levels approach gives a full portrait of the GCF engagement. So monitor safeguards and benefits at the ground level, shape readiness and pipeline development at the national level, and shape policy at the international level. Second, capacity is critical. Capacity to engage and capacity to access the GCF resources are critical. And last and not least, which has been mentioned, is the issue of networking to amplify voice, synergize action and resources, and best practices. And thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimaren. Thank you to all of you. It was fantastic. And of course, thank you to all of you as well. I think we could continue the discussion informally, and we would love to be in touch with you and to see how we can create this wave of transformation change at the local level with all the voices. Thank you very much.